Welcome to Future of Good Live. My name is John White, and I'm managing editor at Future of Good. And we are a media and learning organization with a mission to equip change makers with insights, analysis, and knowledge so they can make a more significant difference at work and in the causes they care about. Our ambition is to enrich 1 million change makers by 2030. Our journalists report on news, solutions, and trends shaping the social impact world on areas where transformative change is happening. Data and technology, equity and inclusion, social finance, philanthropy and giving, and volunteerism and nonprofit workforce. We are a member-enabled organization, and members enable our journalism and learning programming. And thank you for being a member and using Future of Good as a professional resource for learning, development, and decision-making. For the past few months, we've been covering social finance developments and innovations from new angles through Diane Bérard, our social finance reporter. Diane's coverage offers nuanced insights into this fast-growing ecosystem of impact investing and social finance. She covered the launch of the Social Finance Fund, which is one of the most read stories this year. Welcome again, everyone, and welcome, Diane, and I'll turn it over to you.
Good morning, John. Good morning to all the participants. Like John said, I'm the social finance reporter for Future of Good, and we're going to have this fireside talk with Mansib Rahman, who is co-founder and CEO of Radish Coop. From the early days when he imagined Radish, Mansib was concerned about financing its co-op. He knows that technology co-ops like his require massive investment to compete with Uber and other giants. What is singular about Radish is that it plans to issue shares without voting votes. A co-op is one member, one vote, as we all know. So for Radish, the money would come from private investors, but the member would still make all the decisions. It's a stretch. So why would investors choose a co-op? Will Radish push for returns and lose its ethos? This conversation concerns financial innovation, finance role in hyperlocal venture, the extra financial motivation of investors, and the risk associated with mixing money and the common good. So now let's welcome Mansib Rahman, co-founder and CEO of Radish Coop. Good morning, Mansib.
Good morning, Diane. How are you?
I'm very well, thank you. So Mansib, you're located in Montreal. Behind you, there's the skyline of Montreal downtown. So Mansib, what is Radish Coop?
So Radish Coop is basically a food delivery application, kind of like Uber Eats and DoorDash. The main difference being we're structured as a co-op. So we're owned by our members, which are the restaurants, the employees, which include the drivers, and the consumers.
And what problem are you addressing? Why did you decided to launch this co-op?
Yeah, I mean, we kind of started to actually scratch an own inch of mine. Like I'm also a restaurateur. I've been in the restaurant sector my whole life. And, we were having a tough time with the existing platforms. I mean, everyone's kind of heard of the high fees, during the pandemic, et cetera. But there was also a lack of, quality of service. We put a lot of effort in our restaurant to serve our clients, and this kind of wasn't replicated in the other platforms. So we decided with some local restaurants and drivers to start our own alternative platform.
So it's a very hyper-local business. You want to help mom and pop shops. But
Absolutely.
Let's talk a bit about your very emotional relationship with restaurant, because your parents were restaurateurs. You even started to be a restaurateur when you were a teenager. So tell me a bit about that background story.
Yeah, absolutely. So I mean, I like to figuratively say that I was, born in a restaurant. My earliest memories are, even as early as 4 years old, were, being in the restaurant with my parents. It was just something very common. I got, especially back in the day, for a lot of immigrants who would come here, and it was the only way for them to have kind of social mobility. And so, I started working at the restaurant when I was 9 years old, just doing, odd jobs like busboy or washing dishes, etc. And I pretty much took on all the roles over the years. When I was 15, I opened my first restaurant. It was called Côte de Neige Hot Dogs on Côte de Neige. It was not the name choice wasn't mine. And I've managed different restaurants. I've worked in the kitchen. I've done deliveries. Like I've done pretty much every role my whole life. And one thing I've noticed is that it's a very precarious and difficult industry, right? In the United States, I believe that more than 42% of restaurant workers live under the line of poverty, right? And so, basically what I saw every day was that there'd be people who had like no savings, people, who couldn't really move forward. And the fact that like all these other things were coming into the sector, all these other platforms, et cetera, were kind of, detrimental to the health of the sector. So
you chose to launch a co-op. Why did you choose this structure?
Yeah, that's a good question, right? Because almost my whole life I had no clue what a co-op was. I'd never heard of it until much later. Ironically, my parents had heard of it, right? And I had the luck at some point to work at the Mouvement Desjardins, which is right in my background right now. And
just for the record, the Mouvement Desjardins is a bank, not a bank, but a financial institution that's a co-op. It's a gigantic co-op in Quebec, and it's one of Quebec's biggest employer.
Yeah, exactly. One of the largest credit unions or cash systems in the world. And my office, I was working in data and artificial intelligence at Desjardins, and my office was in the entrance, the lobby, right next to the lobby. And every day they'd have my colleague Manel would make presentations about the founding of Desjardins and the story about Mansib Rahman and Desjardins. And I guess I was kind of indoctrinated because I kept hearing the story every day. And what I really liked about the story was two things. The first was how Desjardins was able to kind of bring power, financial power back to the people of Quebec, right? At the time, like they had a very bad situation. There's a lot of usurious kind of lenders that were taking advantage of the local population, and the cash system gave them power to do something about that. And secondly, what was really interesting, and often today when we think about co-ops, we don't think of it like very rapid or startup, or we don't think like that it's a very efficient or fast model. But Alphonse, and at the time, right, on a horseback, he would go town to town with a box of savings, and he would open caisses, right, all across Quebec, Ontario, even in the US, right, and they had no internet, no telephone, no email. And they're able to open up quicker than startups I see today, right? So that was very inspiring for me, and that's when I was like, okay, well, maybe this is a model to offer an alternative to what's out there today.
So what's interesting in your story, Mansib, is that you value co-op ethos, but the financing structure doesn't suit the business model you want to do. So what's the tension between the ethos and your business model?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'd say the co-op model from a financial perspective and even some other perspectives, right, hasn't really had as much iterations since the 1900s and 1800s, right? If you look at the co-op laws, they don't change very often. If you contrast that with like business law, the Canadian Business Corporations Act, that evolves very rapidly. There's a lot of companies being founded, and those companies have like new challenges, and then they go to court and new laws are created. And so people kind of have this perception that the co-op system can't support, like high, growth financing or investment, or that it would not be possible, right? But that's not the case. It's just that it's never been done, right? Because there hasn't been a need. And so in our case, the challenge we had, and the challenge that kind of preoccupied me when we were starting Radish, was like, okay, well, we need all this capital, right? Because even if I'm willing to work for free and volunteer my time, I can't ask like, dozens or hundreds of people to like work for free and work at under market salaries, right? Or at least not drastically under market. And so it became clear that we need to find, a kind of financial resolution. And that's when I started doing some research, and I realized what I saw was that there were some co-ops in the world who are trying to essentially separate the equity piece from the governance piece, right? A notable example is Fonterra in New Zealand, which is one of the world's largest dairy co-ops, right? They do more volumes of milk solids than Kraft, right? And what they essentially achieved was a way for the shares to give economic rights to investors without the voting rights, thus allowing investors to make a return while protecting the governance and the essence of the co-op, which is that the members direct where it goes.
So that's very radical. You have a pick and choose state of mind. What you're saying is that because we're used to one member, one vote. So you're a member of a co-op, you vote, you pay, and it's a closed system. So what you're saying is that, for example, this co-op in Australia. So an investor in Asia could buy a share from an Australian dairy co-op, but he wouldn't get any voting rights. So the members could do whatever they feel was right for the co-op, and they would get the money. So they get the best of both worlds. That sounds a stretch.
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting if you think of it that way. But on the other hand, if you look at existing large corporations like Facebook or Berkshire Hathaway, right, they already have that structure in place. Zuckerberg controls like 90% of Facebook, right? So corporations have already been doing this for a long time. And what we did was we kind of adopted in the co-op model. I think what's notable about Radish is we're the first co-op in the world to do it directly within one co-op, right? Because typically what we saw with Fonterra and other dairy co-ops is that they would create like a vehicle on the side, right? And investors would enter that vehicle, and that vehicle would buy shares in the co-op, right? But what we wanted to do is actually have it all together so that the members had the rights to the intellectual property, that the members had the rights to all the assets, and that we simplified the model, right? We didn't want to create a model that was so complex that our members couldn't actually understand it. And I think the thing to remember, right, because people are often like, okay, well, now you're going to allow all these venture capitalists, all these people to like take advantage of like the business. Most of the investors in our co-op are actually our members, right? Most of the investors are restaurants who purchase some shares or drivers who put in extra hours to earn some shares, right? And this is actually a way for them down the line, crossing our fingers, if we get very, very fortunate 5 to 7 years down the line and we're able to do an IPO or something, right? They would be able to sell those economic rights, right, and in return for money that they could use towards their retirement, right, which is something that is kind of like unheard of in this sector, right? Like the overwhelming majority of people in the restaurant sector have no plans for retirement, right? So I think even though it's radical, I think it brings a lot of kind of benefits for people out there, especially in the sector, especially for our workers, for everyone involved.
So what you're saying is that many of your members are investors, but still in the mind of people, a co-op is a hyper-local investment model. Yeah. So why would an investor who's not a member, so another investor, choose to invest in a hyper-local co-op whose purpose is to satisfy members' needs when he can invest in an incorporated company focused on financial returns? What would be the motivation?
Yeah, so I mean, that's a good question, and a question that I've asked myself a lot when starting out, right? And what was interesting was that, early on during the pandemic, when we were starting Radish, and it was kind of a wild bet, we had some very big investors approach us, right? That we didn't end up working with, but investors who were, the initial seed investors for like the big 4 tech companies, right? And I asked them that question. I'm like, why are you reaching out? How did you even find this, right? And I'm like, why would you want to invest in Radish when you know that our returns are maybe not going to be similar to the existing platforms? And what they said, well, the thing is, at the end of the day, like investors are not dogmatic. They're what they care about is returns, right? So if we're the vehicle that's able to eventually take market share from an Uber or a DoorDash or something else, or create a new market, doesn't necessarily have to take market share, right? Then we're actually making them great returns, right? Because we're the thing that's replacing the existing system, even if it's more equitable. So for them, it's like, whether it's equitable or not, whether it's a bit less money or a bit more, like it's less important. It's more so that this opportunity is the next thing for them, right? And although there are some risks involved because they have limited, say in how to run the business, at the end of the day, they're in it for the return, right? They're not in it to like tell us how to run like a delivery business, right? So if our model, a hyperlocal model, is more successful in the communities that it's in, it's actually a good business decision at the end of the day.
So those investors feel like this hyperlocal model could be the next thing, that people could be interested in, investing with as customer also, so to choose a hyperlocal platform instead of a giant platform, because I mean, you're competing with Uber, you're competing with a big platform, with a big brand, but those investors see, well, maybe I have less return and less power because I don't have government, right? But it's something emerging. So you feel like this hyper-local model is something that people could want to encourage?
Yeah, absolutely. And I, the way I would put it is like, if you look at the large co-ops internationally, like Desjardins, Disruptor, other co-ops around the world, imagine having been an early investor in that type of business, right? The returns would be incredible, right? So whether it's $1 billion or $2 billion or 500 million or whatever the return or value or the capitalization is at the end, it's as long as it's a multiple, right, from growth, right? I think like for most investors, it's not going to matter. I think the thing that might matter a bit more is like the kind of technicalities, because it's never been done, right? Like there's no co-op out there that has raised VC funding in history, right, in the way that we're doing it, right? So I think that's kind of like the point of maybe contention, but we're seeing that that's changing over time, especially as we're realizing that the traditional investments that they were making before are no longer panning out as they used to.
And you're talking about co-op and VC. So I see a risk for Radish to aim for big returns to attract and retain investors and not fulfill its mission toward its client, employees, and members. So how will you ensure investors' economics, right, do not put Radish mission and members right at risk?
Yeah, so I mean, I'd say there's 2 points, right? The first point is that it's always a choice of the members whether they want to raise investment, right? So it's like let's think of it as a loan, right? The members decide, hey, do we want to bring debt into this co-op because we need to finance growth, or do we decide to self-finance or bootstrap or not grow as quickly, right? So the members essentially have the reins at the end of the day, and if they're like, hey, well, for the co-op to be successful, we need to take on, I don't know, X million dollars to be able to really grow things. They made that decision and they constrained that investment in the way that they see best fit. They might be like, we're only selling, I don't know, 10% of the equity. We're putting these restrictions, right? So they decide. But the second thing is, we have to remember that the members, right? And when I say members, especially I'm talking about restaurants and employees, are the principal investors in the co-op, right? And so those members also have an incentive to see the co-op grow economically, right? Because if you're a driver or you're a developer and you're putting time behind Radish and you're going the extra mile, or a restaurant and you're bringing a lot of orders to the platform, you want to see your investment grow economically, right? In French, we have the saying, la primauté des gens sur l'argent. So like the people come
money.
First. Exactly, right? And in this case, people come first because people are saying that this is what's important to them is that their investment grows and that they have economic success, right? So we're not chasing returns, we're chasing what people, what our members want at the end of the day.
At that point, I'll pause and turn to the participant. So now that we've been talking for 20 minutes, you understand better about Radish business model. So if you have any questions for Mansib, any comments, just put them in the chat under the comments section, and we'll be sure to address them. So feel free to just interact with us. And if you don't feel like it, no problem. We'll just keep on talking with Mansib. So I'll be checking the chat once in a while. So you aim to finance a hyper-local co-op serving mom and pop shops, aiming at fair wages for drivers and also money for retirement with traditional investors. Would you say that investing in Radish is a social investment? Would you qualify it as a social investment, as an impact investment? Where do you see it? Suppose you're doing a roadshow, how would you call this investment?
How would we pitch it? Yeah. The thing is, first and foremost, right, I would always want, whether we call it a social investment or not, I would always want to pitch the economic opportunity, right? Because the economic opportunity is huge here, right? Like this could be a business that would essentially, serve the multi-billion-dollar restaurant industry in North America, right, or maybe elsewhere in the world, right? because beyond the food delivery, there's other services we offer restaurants, like technologies to help them with inventory management and waste reduction and payroll and analytics and all this. And this is a huge kind of untapped industry. Restaurants are kind of the last frontier when it comes to technology. So I think the economic opportunity is huge. And the fact that it's aligned with the interests of the users, which are the members of the platform, I think that makes it a social investment, right? Because it's not just a pure money play here. Right? It's a pure money play aligned with the interests of the people that it's impacting, right? And I think that qualifies as kind of, I mean, I'm very biased, but as a gold standard for social investment, right? Because you're kind of bringing together like the economic returns, like the triple bottom line, as some people like to refer to it.
I see. We have a first question. So, how has being located in Montreal helped you or hindered your co-op development? Is there a supportive ecosystem in Quebec? I think we have to make a comment before you answer, is that your co-op is not under Quebec law, it's under Canada's law. Maybe you can explain why you did that, and then tell us about the support, the ecosystem for co-op in Quebec.
Yeah, that's correct. Like our co-op is incorporated federally, right? So we actually incorporated provincially at first under Quebec law. And so the way I describe it in terms of co-op jurisdiction is that Quebec co-op law is actually one of the best in the world, if not the best, as it is right now, right? I'd say for 99% of co-ops, right, if you're doing a grocery store or, you're doing a band of musicians, or you're doing any type of like a farm or something, like the co-op law today is in Quebec is great because it has very specific recipes for you to use, right? And the laws are very protective of it, the members and the essence of what the co-op is. I would say there are some restrictions in the co-op law today, primarily because the co-op law hasn't been adapted for the new kind of reality of the I'd say like the tech first, everything connected, society, right? The reason we actually went to the federal law was for a couple of reasons. The primary being the financing side of things, right? So the Quebec law was kind of restrictive in terms of how to issue shares and financial instruments and et cetera related to raising capital, and that makes sense. That makes a lot of sense, right? Because you want to protect the members from kind of really like really complicated or financial instruments that can be like kind of detrimental, right? And in our case, because we were adopting this kind of like tech startup model that didn't exist in Quebec co-op law, we had to go to the federal law, which had a lot more latitude with that, right? Let's say the Quebec law is like you choose a journey, whereas the federal law is like make your own co-op, right? It's a lot less restrictive. There's the base restrictions to ensure that it's actually a co-op that's in the interest of members, but it means you spend a lot more time and money, right, actually making bylaws, making a co-op like actually legitimate and structured, right? So I actually have to read through the entire provincial law, the federal law. I had to read through the securities laws of Quebec and other provinces, right, to make this work. And it was very, very time consuming. And I read through all the laws from start to end, right? And then with engaged lawyers, and then it cost us, a pretty penny to be able to make it happen, right? So it's not a model, it's not a path I would recommend to every co-op, but for some co-ops that needed like another example of a thing that was kind of restrictive in the Quebec law was that we started during the pandemic. And technically in Quebec law, to incorporate, you have to be in person. Like all the founders have to meet in person and sign the same paper. So during the pandemic, we weren't allowed to meet in person, right? So we actually became the first co-op to get a derogation from the ministry, the Minister of Economy in Quebec, to be able to incorporate our co-op online, right? Because that would legally not be possible. So those are just some of the small things that were there that were restrictive, and that's going to change over time. And I guess to answer the second question, right, like in terms of the ecosystem in Montreal, so I'd say there's a lot of pros and there's some cons as well, right? So we're very fortunate in that Quebec has in my opinion, the best. I'm again biased, but the best co-op ecosystem in the world, right? Because in Quebec, notably, you have over $1 billion of funding and financing available for co-ops, right? Because you have some really big actors, right? You have Desjardins, you have You have Fondation, you have FTQ, you have a lot of funds that, like Quebec is notable because a lot of the pension funds for union workers are managed by the unions, which is, unlike most places in the world, right? So there's all this capital available for social, kind of investments that have a bit more of a social nature. There's also some really big co-ops in Quebec that, have been here since like very early days of the history, of the modern history of the province, right? So the society has kind of been built around, co-ops, right? Even my father, who's an immigrant, right, and came here in 1983, was very intimately familiar with like the Desjardins story, right? So because you have this kind of appreciation, you have like government support for l'économie sociale, you have all these organizations that are here to support you, to incorporate, to hire, etc. I think that's like really positive, and especially when I talk to my counterparts in other parts of the world where they're like, like in the UK, for example, there's only £1 million of funding available for all co-ops together annually. Like I feel very fortunate. That being said, I think the risk is, or like the challenge is in Quebec is the tolerance of risk we have here, and Canada, and maybe not notably in Quebec, in my opinion, right? Because I had friends, for example, at the start of the, prior to the pandemic, who left to other markets, for example, the US or the UK, etc. And they started companies around the same time than I did, right? And despite the fact that they had like no product, or they had, maybe not as much, of a business case demonstrated early on, it was much easier to find funding to just get started, right? If you want to get $1 million in Canada to start a company, you have to do a lot of work and a lot of kind of, I'd have to say a lot of like, like busy work, right? Like kind of like talking to people and networking and demonstrating. And I think that makes sense. I'm not against that, right? But to do a lot more of validation. Whereas in the States, I had friends who went through, say, like Y Combinator, and then they started the business, and they had, raised $5 million without a product, and another 25 million, and now they've raised like, X hundred million, and now they have a product, but they're starting their sales process. And so they're allowed to kind of iterate a lot more quickly, right? They're able to move a lot more quickly, which is something that we can't do. And, that's a challenge, because if you're a slow mover in an industry that moves quickly, right, you're under a lot of pressure, right? Because you're not able to offer products to your members as they need it, right? So that's been a kind of a challenge. But again, like the upside to that is that, like, when things go, haywire, like things go bad, you have a lot more protections, right? Because as we're seeing right now in the market, especially in the US, like those companies that, grew very quickly and raised very quickly are like suffering to stay afloat. Where our business, but actually, to give a concrete example, when we started in Montreal, aside from the large platforms, there was 11 other local platforms, right, like small incorporations or nonprofits, et cetera, who tried to also enter the space. And today, all of them are gone, right? There's not a single one that's still active other than us, right? And I think the fact that we were a co-op and we kind of, relied on local support to stand up allowed us to, to pérenniser, or like be, sustainable, or at least more sustainable alternatives. So I think that's how I would kind of like portray like the pros and cons of being situated here.
We have another question. How is managing employees different in a co-op, or is it? Do the value of the co-op make a difference? Well, in a co-op, it's members, it's not employees. So maybe you can expand on that.
Yeah, that's a great question, because the thing about co-ops, I think a lot of people kind of have an assumption about that in my opinion is not correct, is that a co-op is inherently a good vehicle, right? Like a co-op is not inherently a vehicle that has to be positive. You can have bad co-ops, right? And there are examples of this. In the US, you have consumer co-ops that treat their employees like very badly. I'm not saying all of them are like that, but there are instances, right? And that's because at the end of the day, the co-op serves the needs of its members. So if the members have intentions that are not, positive towards the employees, especially if the co-op has no kind of employee representation in the membership, then it could totally be, bad, right? You have co-ops that like operate like public companies. And on the other hand, you have co-ops that operate like very, in the interest of the members, of the employees, because it's an employee-run co-op, right? So the co-op can kind of be run in any way, really, at the end of the day. In our case, employees have a direct representation, and that includes the delivery drivers, right? They're on our board, right? So, I think that allows us to have representation that's more in line with their needs and interests. But I think it'll also evolve over time. We're a very small co-op. It's one thing when you're like 15, 20 people. It's a very different thing when you're thousands of employees across the country.
So can you please specify, Mansib, who are the members of your co-op? What group are they from?
Yeah, so there's 3 member classes in Radish, right? And all member classes have equal representation, right? So the first class is the merchants. So merchants include restaurants, they include other food businesses. So for example, bakeries or fishmongers or butchers, etc. And technically, perhaps down the line, they'll include other businesses like farms or florists, etc. And then we also have the employees, right? So employees include both the operational logistical staff and the corporate staff, right? So it includes delivery drivers who are all either full-time or part-time employees of the co-op. And then it includes, corporate staff, which is developers, marketing, management, etc. And then we have consumers, right? So consumers is anyone who purchases from the co-op, but also anyone who kind of contributes on the products of, through the products of the co-op, right? So an example of that is, anyone who leaves like reviews of restaurants, anyone who, takes photos of restaurants, anyone who contributes to the sector as like a consumer, right? And all member classes kind of have equal representation on the board. So it's 33% for each member class.
So when we started the conversation, you very well nailed all the challenges of those small restaurants, because we're talking about most of your restaurants are small restaurants. So about the fact that there's no social net, there's no security for old age, and the wages are very low, like for drivers also. So basically, what we're talking about is finding ways for traditional finance, for money to move toward certain sectors of the economy who need it, by organizing these businesses so it would be appealing for traditional investors. Because when we're talking social finance, basically what we're saying is that we need finance to have a conscience. We need finance to have a social impact, and we want to find ways for finance to be interested in that impact. So how do you see what you're doing as helping for this grand idea of moving finance toward impact? How do you feel your role in this?
Yeah. I mean, I think our primary role is serving as like a use case, right? Like we're in a petri dish, basically, right? I think a lot of people are watching from the sidelines. They're trying to see, like, is this kind of co-op, for-profit co-op model, like, actually a viable alternative? Like, can this actually compete with large conglomerates at the same time making returns and serving the interests of its members? And honestly, like, no one knows, even myself, right? It's totally possible that a year from now we're no longer here, and it's also possible that 10 years from now that we're like a fixture in the national economy, right? So I think the first thing is, like, it's a source of experimentation, and over time what we're seeing is there's more investors who are like on the sidelines being like, hey, you know what, like, I want to consider an investment in this type of vehicle to see what happens, or like, we're going to study the case, right? So I think that's the first thing. I think we're also determining a lot of best practices, right? Because in the creation of our co-op, we, like I mentioned, a lot of experimentation, in terms of like the legal structure, in terms of like how we serve our members, and et cetera. And so, we're kind of hoping to create a playbook on how to create like this type of, social venture, which is both like economically viable and, socially motivated, right? I get a lot of outreach from other people who are interested in starting a co-op startup now. Whereas, like, that was never a thing before, right? Like, an example is I know a pharmacist, for example, who wants to create a co-op of pharmacists in Quebec, right, to kind of help revitalize the pharmaceutical industry here, right? And I think that's something that in the past, like, a lot of people would have just been like, oh, well, you have the large co-ops that already exist, and like the space for new co-ops is only like, small local artisanal things, right? So I think the fact that we're kind of holding the flambeau, the torch, is like what's making us which is what is our like kind of main contribution to the ecosystem.
So what are you keeping in mind? What is your North Star? Is that the word, North Star? So what are you keeping in mind to make sure that you reach your goal? Because there will be many hurdles. What you're trying to do, like you say, haven't been done. You want to make a for-profit co-op. You want to mix different kind of investors with different intentions. So what are you keeping your mind on?
Yeah. Well, I mean, it boils down to 2 points, right? I think the first thing is what we're doing economically viable, right? Because if it's not economically viable, even if it's a sustainable practice or if it's a good for the world, we won't be able to support it, right? Because we'll run out of money, right? Like, and we're not a nonprofit, so we can't just rely on public funding and et cetera for forever to run that service, right? So I think economic viability is the first thing, but the second thing we ask ourselves is, does this serve the needs of our members, right? And their interests, right? And the needs of our members are usually around, being able to sustain their business, being environmentally conscious, being like, mindful of how employees are treated, right? So as those concerns are not, if we're kind of flying in the face of those concerns every time we make a decision, then we're also not doing our job, right? So I think as long as those 2 points are maintained, like, we're kind of moving in the right direction. And then aside from that, then it's just a question of like optimizing, right? Because there's a way to get there quickly, and then there's a way to get there, slowly over time, and one way is more radical than the other, right? So we're always kind of like balancing that path.
So all your businesses, your restaurant, what they want to do is to stay in business and maybe grow their business a bit. And you entered with a service that is the delivery service. But what you want to do for them is much more than that. And when we did the prep call, you talked to me about how to help them to manage their inventory with their prices, because we know as consumers that the prices of food are just delirious. So they are for a restaurateur. So tell me, how will you help them also to, buy food or change or optimize or swap food when it's too expensive? That's something I would like you to share.
Yeah, absolutely. So, right, like our actual mission, right, is not to be a food delivery business, even though that's what I tell people because it's easier to explain. But our actual mission is to mutualize the needs, the technical needs of the restaurant industry, and it includes every facet. And so an example of that is kind of inventory management, right? Because as a restaurateur, I know very well that a huge portion of the produce and foodstuffs we buy goes to waste, right? Because it's very hard to predict how much food you need to prepare next week, especially since the pandemic. You might have a very busy week, like where the restaurant is totally packed, and next week where it's totally empty. But like you can't see in the future, right? So you don't know how much to buy exactly, right? The thing is, as a platform, since we have data from all these different restaurants, right, as a co-op, we can actually collate this data and use predictive analytics to see like what should be the consumption or the utilization of foods in the future, right? So if we're like, we look at, right, let's say we use it for different market factors. So we're like, oh, well, look, it's getting colder right now. There's a situation in Ukraine, so the price of wheat is going up, right? We can use those factors to then, suggest to restaurants like, hey, your food costs are going to go up by 5%. You should switch from, eggplants to tomatoes to make soup instead of salads or something, right? Or this week will be more quiet because it's raining. You should buy less, right? And it also allows them to make, decisions in real time, right? So right now, restaurants reflect their menus based on their past experience, right? So if the last 6 weeks or 8 weeks they've been losing money, then they're like, hey, we need to raise menu prices, right? But it's already been 8 weeks since they've been losing money on those menus, right? So now they could actually be like, hey, well, our food costs are going up. Like, this is what it needs to, this is what the menu price needs to be to maintain our margins, right? And on the flip side, if they find cheaper ingredients or able to switch their items, they can also tell them to lower their menu price to bring in more clients, right? So that's something we're working on. That I think it's more of a longer term project because there's a lot of data collection and algorithms to train. But we've been supported through the state, through Rethink Quebec, notably to do this project to help especially bring down emissions in the restaurant sector from all the waste, right? Because again, a lot of this food is literally being thrown out every week because they're, it's just going bad in the fridge waiting.
We have a question from Edouard Sylvestre. With local investing, you can see your investments impact. Also, investors are much more involved in the success of the project and business, unlike the traditional market. And what he says is that he'd be interested by a market where he could invest in businesses, co-op, and social enterprise in his neighborhood. So what do you think about a local financial market? Just like there are local businesses, would that make sense? A local financial market where I would invest in a venture that is just around my corner, that is part of my everyday life?
I love that question because it kind of like touches on some things that I'm personally passionate about, and then I hope to see in the long term. I think right now, like the main kind of restrictions, or not restrictions, the hurdles are kind of protections, protections for consumers, right? Because when you open up a lot of local investments, meaning that organizations are going to be run by people who are not necessarily, maybe have the financial kind of acumen, right? That's necessary to take, funding from private investors, especially investors who are not accredited. There's a risk with that, right? So naturally, regulatory bodies have a concern with that. But what's notable about the co-op model, right, is that in a co-op, any member can invest in the co-op. So technically, right, like I mentioned, our restaurants, our drivers, our consumers can actually directly invest in our co-op, right? So someone who orders pizza on Radish can buy shares in Radish, right? And so we actually have in co-ops, you have something that's known as like the Disruptor, right, or the patronage dividends, which is basically the proceeds from the activities that are returned to its members, right? And that's decided by the board annually. And so one thing that we're hoping to do is allow members to allocate those patronage dividends in their communities towards local projects that they are passionate about. Kind of in the same way that Desjardins does it, right? So in Desjardins, you have the branches, and branches, a branch can be like, hey, well, we're the cast for arts and media, so we're going to make grants for local artists. And then another cast could be like the Caisse Solidaire, could be like, we're going to make grants to help people, buy electric cargo bikes to like reduce emissions. So in our case, our interest would be to allow members to invest these patronage dividends in local restaurant projects, right? Because restaurants are notably difficult to finance. And you can imagine, especially say you're a couple of young chefs, right? You have a lot of experience, you want to start your first restaurant. No banks are going to lend you money, right? Because it's a very risky endeavor. So you could actually raise funding through the community if you're members in the restaurant sector, right? Who could provide, say, the seed capital for you to start the restaurant and eventually get some more funding, right? And that would be a sort of like community investment and community funding that would, because it's kind of mediated through the co-op, would allow those investments to be kind of managed professionally, right? And coordinated. So that's something I would like to see through Radish down the line. Again, like it's not something I'm saying is going to happen like tomorrow. And I think for the larger question, like I'd love to see a kind of local investment model, and we have things like that are happening, right? In Calgary, for example, you have a couple of local investment co-ops that are doing exactly that allow members to kind of invest in local projects, right? So I think it's something that we're going to see a lot more, and maybe through a social finance fund or other, like we'll actually be able to like kind of kickstart that type of investments across the country.
So since you mentioned food waste, Steve would like to know if you see an opportunity to address food insecurity and include it in your corporate social responsibility, since you're dealing with a business that's all about food.
Yeah, I mean, it's something I'd like to do. Again, I think it's always a concern of like, focusing on getting, we have to like focus on getting the core right before we kind of branch off into a lot of things. But I think we could totally do that, right? Because once you have data, right? Once you have data from all the businesses, right? Which we have, because again, we have the sales data of the restaurants and et cetera. So we know what their consumption is. We know what their inventory looks like. There's so much optimization you can do, right? Because that's like I think one of the big problems in the world is not that we're short on stuff. We're not short on food in the world, right? But what we're short on is like the allocation. You have some areas which have way too much of a resource, and other areas who have total lack of that resource, right? And so that data would allow us to reallocate those resources, and the logistics component of having a delivery network would allow us to actually like transit those resources across, right? So I think it's very I think it's definitely where we want to go down the line. But I think it's like, we have to go one step at a time, right? Because the first step is getting that data, getting that network in place, getting that logistics component. Because if you have too many hurdles to be able to be like, hey, I'm going to take this excess flour and send it to another city, well, then it's not going to work out, right? But I totally see us going to that direction, and there's already a lot of I think successful businesses in that area, Too Good to Go and et cetera, that are models to kind of
flash food and all those applications.
Yeah, absolutely.
Tell me, Mansib, you have big ambitions for Radish. How will you stay hyper-local between the growth and the hyper-local? I know you have ambitions to go in other markets. We'll see that in a few weeks when you have some announcement to make. But how will you make sure you stay hyper-local? Because that's the appealing proposition, the helping the mom and pop shop. So what's your plan?
Yeah, so something that we built into Radish from the get-go is actually somewhat of a decentralized model. So basically, each region has their local governing board, right? So it's kind of like a federation where you have, I guess, different regions where their local governing board takes on certain decisions that are more pertinent to the region. So, for example, the pricing and branding might differ in Montreal to say Saguenay to London, Ontario, right? So that's something that we have, and that allows the kind of larger co-op to focus on the big picture things, or things that kind of need to be shared, right? So the tech infrastructure is not something you want to replicate in each city, right? The legal structure is not something you want to replicate in each city because that's expensive and time consuming. What you want to do is empower each region to focus on the things where they can really make a difference, right? So I think, and how that works on a more literal level, right, is that each board locally is the overall board structured with that equal representation between the classes, right? The consumers, the employees, and the commerces, and they, those are voted by those regions members, and then they vote for delegates that go onto the kind of national or federal level and vote for the larger board, right? So that's our plan, to kind of hopefully stay super local and decentralized while still having a coordination amongst our different kind of members across the different geographical regions.
So basically what we discussed this morning is how traditional finance can be hyper local. How what we see as a finance that doesn't know any frontiers, that people invest everywhere. That's the point of the stock market. And then we're talking today about a different kind of finance who's hyper-local, but still has big economic ambition. So you're saying, and I'm going back to what you said to make sure I understand correctly, that you could be the first Canadian co-op to issue an IPO somewhere down the road. That would be an experiment. And
sorry, Diane, we would actually be the first co-op in the world to IPO
in the world, to issue an IPO, and that would be a thing for the traditional investors that are not members of the co-op, but you have also many investors that are members of the co-op. So naturally, if there's an IPO, they could cash, so that could help them with their life and retirement down the lane. So basically, we're looking at how to hyper-localized finance and make it, for the communities, because what I understand is that all those mom and pop shops are in communities. So as long as they exist, well, they contribute to the community.
Absolutely, yeah. I'd say it's we want to basically plug in the local communities to the global market of finance, right? I think it's very ambitious. We'll see where that goes. Maybe 10 years down the line, hopefully the listeners to this interview will look back to this and I guess evaluate whether it worked out or not. But we want to plug local communities to the global financial market in a way that's kind of secure and sustainable and beneficial to everyone.
So beneficial for the members who have shares, and beneficial for the investors who can have a blended impact the social impact on the community and the economic impact as a financial return.
Yeah. I mean, it's like as an investor, like choosing to be like, hey, I don't want to just invest in like one very specific, I don't want to just invest in Silicon Valley. I want to invest in Regina, right? I want to invest in suburbs and small towns across, North America and maybe elsewhere in the world, right? And like being able to pick those investments, I think that's what we're trying to offer.
Well, we surely hope as this pilot project goes that you win your bet, because that could open the door and open the mind of investors, because I think that we have to win investors to this kind of model and explain. I think you have a lot of explaining to do. We have another question. Would you IPO 49% and still have the members keep control?
So we could actually, in theory, and I'm not saying this is what's going to happen, in theory, a co-op we could sell 100% of the equity and the members would control 100% of the governance, right? Or 80% technically, because our investors have a maximum of 20% of the board by law, right? So it's not something that could ever be, like broken through. But they're selling, again, the economic rights. So they're selling the rights to their dividends. They're not selling the rights to the co-op. So they could sell 100% of the equity of the co-op to anybody, right? And still have total control of the co-op. That's like in the bylaws. It's in actually the federal law. So like, yeah.
So that's the basic argument, the separation of the governance right and the economic right. So members have economic rights, have governance right, and investors have economic rights. So they have right for the returns, the dividends, and the members have the right of ruling the co-op. So they decide on where the co-op is going, what is happening with the co-op, and the investors get the returns.
Exactly. Yeah. The economic rights can be transacted. And again, like I'd use a parallel to like companies in the US that already do this, right? Like Berkshire Hathaway, right? Very limited control, or Facebook or other, Shopify. The investors have almost no control of those businesses, right? They're all often held by, the founding team or some really early investors, and they've already figured this piece out, right? What we're doing is we're like, okay, well, instead of concentrating that governance, that control in one individual, right? Let's spread it out amongst all the users of the platform in a way that's equitable, right? And every person who's implicated gets one vote. So every vote it's a democratic way of like giving that control.
So I'm looking at the time. So if any participant has a question, it would be a good time to ask it, because we're almost at the end of this webinar. And if not, what would you like, Mansib, to leave people with? Is there something you want what do you want them to keep from this conversation? And what's your wish for the next step?
Well, I mean, the first and foremost is if you live in Montreal, please order from us. That helps us tremendously, or give us feedback on the platform and stuff. But I think on a greater level is I think if anyone is interested in social investment, social impact, kind of really making a change in society, like I'd like to see maybe more risk tolerance, right? Like I think people need to go out there and make audacious models that are kind of different, that kind of like try to transcend what's traditionally out there, not kind of be constrained by what we assume is a social investment, and try to make new vehicles, new structures possible, right, in different communities, right, locally, and try to make that change, right? Because like I think where we're kind of stuck is that people are kind of just like trying to reconcile. We're still stuck on the question of, can something that's socially good also be economically viable? And like people are kind of like philosophizing, or like thinking about whether that's a good thing or not. But the only way to really know is to try it out, right? If we don't try it out, like we'll never know, right? So I'd like to see more people, whether you're an investor, whether you're an entrepreneur, whether you're someone who's interested in working at such a company, is to actually like go make those projects happen, right? Try to get those projects funded and off the ground, like lobby your governments or other supporters in the sector to move this forward, and then see what happens, right? Because like if we don't if we don't try it out, like everything is moot. Where the point is just moot. So I think that's like the real takeaway I'd like people to have from this.
And I think I could sum it up by, it's not because it hasn't been done that it can't be done. And very often we think that because something does not exist, that it's because it's impossible for it to exist. But it's not like that. So I think that's your pledge, that it's not because something has not been done that it can't be done.
Yeah, I mean, this is going to sound crazy, right? But like, imagine 300-400 years ago when democracy was not a thing, right? Or like overall in most places was not a thing. It was just everyone was either a dictator or a king or a monarchy or whatever. Mm-hmm. Like proposing democracy would have been crazy, right? But like there are people who, you know, who went ahead and like pushed for that, and like now anything that's not a democracy is like seen as being crazy, right? So mm-hmm. you know, imagine a future where like most companies are democratically controlled. Like that could happen. I'm not saying it has to happen. I'm not saying every company needs to be a co-op, but what I'm saying is we could see a future where that kind of where the structure of these companies and investments are radically different than today.
Thank you, Mansib. I'll ask a participant before we go. We have 2 Slido questions for you. So can you please go on slido.com and then type the number 3613626. And then we have 2 questions for you. So if you're on the Slido platform, the first question is, did you learn something useful for your work from all this live conversation with Mansib? Something that you could actually put into action or discuss with your colleagues at work after this live webinar? So I repeat the question. Did you learn something useful for your work from this webinar? So it's a yes/no question. I'll give you 30 seconds to answer this question. And for those who see it on the screen, there's the slido.com website and the number to type to answer the first question. And then we'll go with the second question. So, would you recommend this webinar to your network? So think about your network, and could people in your network use the information that Mansib shared with us today? And you have, again, 30 seconds to answer this question. Would you recommend this webinar to your network? Oh, here you have somebody who wants you, Mansib, to expand your operations to Ottawa, where Future of Good is located, so they could encourage you.
Yeah, I mean, you know, feel free to reach out on LinkedIn, right? I'd love to make that happen eventually.
Yeah, that has been a great interview. Steve echoed both of the comments. He wants you in Ottawa, and he thinks this interview was amazing. Well, thank you to all the participants for being there, and a huge thank you to you, Mansib, for taking the time to discuss with us and share your insight and your views on how we could expand the weight co-op have in the economy, because ultimately it's about that, and find a way to direct financial flows for a triple bottom line more often. So thank you very much, Mansib.
Yeah.
Have a good day.
Yeah, thank you, Diane, and to all the participants, as well as the Future of Good team for having me.
Thank you, and have a good day, everybody.